Good day. It is great to have you here today with us at Back Bay Mission. Today we're back in the office, my office here in Biloxi. Hopefully later in the week we'll be out at the shipyard and we'll bring you something different next week on location. So today I wanted to talk a bit about a maybe sensitive subject for some. And it may be considered very political, and yet our entire culture seems to be divided politically. Whether you're red or blue, Democrat, Republican, black or white, masking, not masking, vax, not vaxing. You know, we're so incredibly polarized, and so I almost feel as if whatever I say today will probably polarize us, but I would hope you wait till the end to kind of get some clarification about what I'm going to share. I am finding it relatively saddening concerning our polarization and division in this country, because I do believe this political polarization around issues is really damaging to the core of who we are as a people, as individuals, physically, emotionally, and spiritually. So my question at the outset is when do we begin to listen to each other? And when do we begin to actually hear one another? And attempt to understand and put ourselves in the shoes of the other. Right here at Back Bay we have something we call In Their Shoes. And it's supposed to give people an experience of walking in the shoes of somebody who's unsheltered and what that may mean. And I think it's time to do that around all of these issues that are so divisive right now. I had a wonderful conversation with one of our Biloxi City Council persons at the Rotarian Club yesterday, Felix Gines, and we had a conversation about the wade-in which desegregated Biloxi's beaches. And it's interesting because even that story has so many really draws people to a place of polarization, right, about who did what, when. But today I want to talk about, and this may mean you click off of this, but the critical race theory, or CRT as some are calling it. And I want to give you the kind of textbook description or definition of critical race theory, because I think we haven't actually even defined. As we have so many different news stories and so many different news sources, I'm afraid that even this term, critical race theory, has so many definitions. We don't have a common definition. We don't really understand what we're talking about. Now, Wikipedia, which is the fount of all knowledge and source of all knowledge, says critical race theory is a cross-disciplinary, intellectual and social movement of civil rights scholars and activists who seek to examine the intersection of race and law in the United States and to challenge mainstream American liberal approaches to racial justice. So, good definition, bad definition, it's a definition, right? And all of us probably would add or detract from that. But one thing I do want to share, we had a moment here this last Friday where black lawmakers walked off the Mississippi Senate floor in protest of the critical race theory bill. And they walked off before the vote because it was a bill designed to prohibit the teaching of critical race theory in states' public schools. The challenge is, though, again, with so many definitions, it was so difficult, right, to make that determination. So the debate on the bill lasted about an hour, and it passed in our Senate 32-2. And the question was asked, why is this bill actually needed? The bill was entitled Critical Race Theory Prohibit, because in August, the Mississippi Department of Education told the Clarion Ledger that the theory wasn't even being taught in any schools in Mississippi. But the bill had no intent of changing history, one lawmaker said. And I quote, this lawmaker said, all it does is say that we're not telling any child that they're inferior or superior to another. That's interesting, isn't it? So what does the term really mean? I think the term is symbolic in nature. The bill doesn't prevent schools from teaching about race or history or civil rights events. It doesn't even explicitly outlaw teaching critical race theory. Instead, it says that no school can teach a course that suggests that any race, any sex, any ethnicity, any religion, or national origin is inherently superior or inferior. Now, I think probably most people watching this would say, we're all in this boat together. We're all human beings, right? We're all seeking equity and justice and equality. And no one is better and no one is less than. The challenge, I think, is in this country that so much of our understanding about better than or less than is based on class and based on money and based on the things you have and based on the education that you have, right? Back in Arizona, when I was a pastor there, I used to have one of the students that was working his way through becoming a minister, and he said, James, you're kind of an educational elitist. And I kind of had to check myself, right? Because this individual was not going to go to seminary, was going to be licensed to be a minister, but wouldn't have that seminary or that classical theological education, which I value for myself and for my profession so much. But I had to check myself and say, does that mean I see or will see him as less than and myself as more than because of my education? Just a thought to think about. So this critical race theory was developed all the way back in the 70s and 80s as a way to analyze how systemic racism came about in the United States through public policy and through institutions. And I think that's a great thing to look at, right? And it also addresses how individuals who are living in the margins, if that's women, if that's people who are Black or Asian American or Native American or Indigenous or Latinx, how they were being kept from housing in certain areas of a city, certain areas of a town, because of redlining or because of institutions or public policies. Now, what was interesting for me this week, there was a close friend from Arizona that sent me a NPR, National Public Radio spot, which I absolutely love National Public Radio. And I would have to say, Mississippi Public Radio is honestly one of the best public radios I've ever heard. They have so many engaging stories. And it's pretty much all day. But this national NPR spot was based on a new book by Imana Perry, who's one of my favorite authors, writers, speakers. And the book is entitled South to America, A Journey Below the Mason-Dixon to Understand the Soul of a Nation. Now, I've ordered the book, and actually it was just available yesterday, and so I'm supposed to have it on Friday. But what Imana Perry says in this book is that if you want to understand the United States, and you want to understand race and equity and racism, the South holds the key. And I think that was a fascinating statement. She was born actually in Birmingham, Alabama, always considers the South her home. She's a professor of African American Studies at Princeton University. And in this new book, she recounts her travels to the South, cities, rural areas, historic sites around civil rights, and reflects on the region's history around civil rights. Now, what I think is really interesting is, and I think this is another one of those divisions in our country, North and South, right? Red and white, state by state. She says, if you really want to know the United States, you must really understand the South. And I kind of get what she's saying, being back in the South. The ideas about race, she said, we get them from the way the stage was set in the South, from the beginning. In some ways, she says, it's an origin point for the way the whole nation operates. And that is so true. The North has as much racism and issues around civil liberties as the South. There's really no difference. And she said, and I love what she says here, she is a woman of color, she says, the South oftentimes is dismissed as backward and racist. And she says it's a mischaracterization. And she says it lets the rest of the country off the hook, right? Oh, isn't that so true? We scapegoat, we blame so that we can get off the hook. So to that I kind of say a big amen, because the South has been in many ways vilified, but the history of the South is the history of the North, because it is our collective history. It's our history as a people living on this land that was, by the way, stolen from indigenous people who were here before us. And so Perry says the South has always been a vanguard of the way the nation would develop. And she points out that the majority of the founding fathers were Southern. Washington, D.C. is considered Southern. That much of the nation's wealth can be traced back to really tragic moments in our history, whether it was with the indigenous people or slavery in the South and in the North. So I think, for me, as I consider this black and blue and vax or not vaxxed or North or South or whatever divides us as people, male, female, black and white, to be very honest about our country, to be honest about our history, and to listen to each other and how we understand history so that we can get a clearer understanding of why we are the way we are. In a sense, it's accepting our past. It's not necessarily feeling guilty or punished by our past, but it's also about not reliving that past, right? And being and doing and being better human beings in the future. And checking in on our own worldviews. Be aware of the systems that keep people poor and marginalized and oppressed and keep people homeless. As we do so much work with homelessness here in Back Bay Mission. And giving to people, to all people, right? A hand up and not a hand down, as we like to say at Back Bay Mission. So 2 Saturdays ago, and this is the way I kind of like to summarize this. I'm not coming up with a definition for the critical race theory for you. You got to do your research, right? And we need to come to some sort of clarity and understanding. But 2 Saturdays ago, I was sitting at the counter at my local Waffle House, and I've kind of fallen in love with the Waffle House. You know, we were all masked, the staff were masked, but we had to take off to eat. But I was reading a book entitled Pre-Post Racial America, and then another one by Robin DiAngelo entitled Nice Racism. And I was having a biscuit and jam and some good Waffle House coffee. And suddenly on the radio came the song Lean on Me. And I and my server, we started to kind of hum along really loudly because it was one of the songs in my previous congregation that the band would start. We would often end our worship service with that, especially during the season of COVID. And suddenly, as the chorus began, the staff and the patrons all began to sing out loud at the top of their lungs. And I have to say, it kind of chokes me up right now as I think about that moment. But as the song goes, is sometimes in our lives we all have pain, we all have sorrow. But if we're wise, we know that there's always tomorrow. And then the whole Waffle House just started singing at the top of their lungs. Lean on me when you're not strong. I'll be your friend and I'll help you carry on. For it won't be long till I'm going to need somebody to lean on. And then it says, please swallow your pride. Please swallow your pride. If I have things you need to borrow, for no one can fill those needs, that you won't let it show. You just call on me, brother, sister, when you need a hand. We all need somebody to lean on. And honestly, that is the God honest bottom truth, isn't it? That we need somebody to lean on, and that we're called to lean on each other. Black and white, vaxxers and non-vaxxers, and mask or no mask, rich and poor. That it's critical that we realize that we are united, and there's more that we have in common than we have in our differences. And so I encourage you to consider that song, and maybe you can sing it a little bit in your mind right now. But lean on me, and swallow our pride, and listen, and dialogue, and discover, and look at our history honestly, and then really don't feel guilt or remorse for that history, but live in the now, and live to be a better human being, to bring more equity and justice into the world. That's kind of what we're about here at Back Bay. And as we're moving into our 100th anniversary, and we're looking at the theme, Back Bay Mission making trouble on the coast for 100 years, making good trouble, I think it reminds me of John Lewis and reminds me of the ongoing challenge of liberty, and the ongoing challenge of liberation, the ongoing challenge of equity and justice. But it reminds me that we need to lean on each other and walk hand in hand and heart in heart. So I hope this was helpful today. And I hope I opened up a lot more questions for you than I did answers, because it's really not about me having the answers, but it's about us embracing the questions. So today, live into those questions, and just sense within yourself love and liberation and peace and mercy and justice. So thank you for joining me today. As always, we would love you to support Back Bay Mission, certainly with your finances, but especially with your prayers, with your thoughts, with your action, making a trip down here to volunteer. So thanks for joining me, and have a peace-filled and a justice-filled day. Thank you.